yeah, thank you for joining me at the end of the day. I know it's been a long weekend for everyone. So yeah, my name is Cameron. So I won't repeat my title again, but just to give a broad overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll introduce a little bit about me and my research. I'll share a little bit about why I think that gender, and specifically masculinities, is an important issue for the vegan and animal rights movement to consider. And then in the second half of my presentation, I'll introduce a little bit about my specific methods and some of my findings, and then a few conclusions and sort of brief recommendations of how I think this research could perhaps be utilized by people within the movement. So yeah, I'm a postgraduate researcher at Edge Hill University, and a member of the Centre of Human Animal Studies there. And my pivot thesis focuses on men and masculinities within the UK vegan and animal rights movement. And I'm going to draw on today some of the findings that I'm also written in a paper that I'm hopefully trying to get published, which is titled Masculinities in Transition, a Narrative and Life History Study of the UK Vegan Activist Movement. And yeah, inspired by some of the other talks today, also kind of acknowledge the fact that I am a cisgendered, white, British man, and that is the perspective that I'm kind of speaking on and from today as well. So yeah, a little bit about why gender, why I think this, at this particular moment, is an important issue for the movement to consider. So I think we've seen in recent times a rise of what some academics have described as kind of reactive hypermasculinities. And these forms of masculinities that were maybe somewhat on the fringes of society seem to be becoming increasingly prominent within mainstream politics, mainstream sort of cultural and societal debates, perhaps embodied by the re-election of Donald Trump in the United States. But we've also seen statements, for example, from Mark Zuckerberg, who recently talked about how he felt the corporate culture was being neutered, and kind of effeminized, and that we need more masculine energy, as if we don't already have enough within that kind of environment. So this seems to be something that's sort of happening and developing at the moment, and this kind of hypermasculinity seems to be kind of on the rise, and kind of the manosphere, these kind of concepts seem to be growing in importance and having increasingly influence over kind of mainstream politics. So, and I would also, kind of argue that these things are very much related, to a rise in kind of, authoritarianism, oligarchy, extremism. For example, Zuckerberg made these comments on masculine energy along the same time as he, slashed UGI within the spaces, removed injunctions around calling transgender people, it on Meta's platforms, and yeah, also kind of, remove more centrist and liberal members of the company, and remove fact checkers from the platforms. So ultimately, what has this got to do with veganism, and why should the vegan animal rights movement care at all about this? And what I want to argue is that these forms of masculinity are very much ingrained with also the consumption of meat and the consumption of animal bodies and products, right? So Zuckerberg himself recently stated, about how he's raising high quality beef in his expansive ranch in Hawaii. This is a small island state that's already been devastated by the effects of climate change. And some people have argued that this kind of discourse and some of the, as part of his kind of what some people have called a toxic revamp, right? So trying to kind of reframe himself as kind of this kind of cool and kind of engaging guy. And the consumption of meat seems to be kind of key to this. Another recently kind of hyper-masculine and arguably oligarchical figure that we've seen very prominently recently has been Elon Musk. And again, he used Joe Rogan's podcast as a platform to state that, the animals aren't going to make any difference to global warming, 0%, nothing. People eat pure steaks, it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. So you can arguably see this as a shift from sort of modest eco-credentials maybe at one point to kind of flat out climate denialism, as we all know in this room, that, the animal industry is so ingrained with the kind of the climate crisis and the acceleration of the climate crisis. And as well as these kind of political and kind of economic figures, maybe more stereotypical figures of the manosphere have also ingrained their hypermasculinities with a specific focus on kind of meat and endorsing of carnivore diets, right? So Joe Rogan has talked about how he's, going on a carnivore diet and has done this sort of sporadically over the last few years. And, Andy Tate with this three, steaks, eggs, broccoli, onions, garlic, cheese. Next time you go to eat anything, ask yourself why you're not eating a plate of these things instead. It tastes better and you'll stop having a limp dip, right? So very much ingraining kind of hypermasculinity, the consumption of animal products, within the discourses. And, this is having huge 200,000 likes, 600,000 views. It's having huge influence on big audiences. So not only are we seeing kind of members of the toxic masculine sphere kind of embed meat eating into what they're doing, but I also think we see a lot of meat influencers, as some have coined it, use hyper-masculine kind of imagery and kind of ideas in what they in their promotion of meat eating as well. So the Raw Egg Nationalist, who is a UK-based kind of social media presence and author, combines hypermasculinity, white nationalism, and meat eating, and kind of frames himself as anti-soy globalism, as he's called it, right? So it's kind of this return to this primal masculine kind of age, and it's some of this is quite extreme right-wing views alongside the promotion of meat and animal consumption. Another example is the Liver King, again taken from his Instagram, where he self-proclaims himself as wanting to lead the Department of Masculinity so that men can become great again. And it's all kind of alongside images of him tucking into, raw livers and images of, his bulging biceps and these kind of images. And another, the author of the Carnivore Diet, Ron Baker, again, linking anti-veganism, misogyny, fat phobia to this discourse. And again, arguably, this is beginning to enter into the mainstream of politics. For example, we've seen RFK in the US elected as the health secretary, and one of his key slogans as part, that he's been promoting is this idea of make frying oil tallow again, and is trying to frame seed oils and plant-based oils as in some way unhealthy, and that beef-based products are kind of the solution to our health crisis. So based on this, I also kind of want to argue, and this is perhaps where it becomes slightly more contentious, that when, as the vegan movement, we try and reframe veganism in line with kind of these hyper-masculinities, we actually end up kind of reinforcing some of these problematic issues we see in society, right? So real men, real vegetables, not dead animals, or some aspects of, for example, the Game Changers documentary. I believe, for example, as Brooks and Michelle Finkel stated, that these discourses can reinforce a hegemonic gender hierarchy, which has actually enabled and continues to enable the oppression of women and marginalized groups, as well as the exploitation of non-human animals and the broader destruction of our natural environment. So essentially, I think that these discourses come from a place of feeling like masculinity is questioned by vegans and they're kind of reactive, but actually they end up reinforcing the problem. However, this is far from the full picture, and I have, also seen from a number of different research sources that veganism and the vegan movement can be a really positive force in the lives of men and can be kind of quite transformative in gender relations. Kadri Vic showed how the Estonian animal activist movement was able to center feminist values, intersectional values, and problematic individuals, particularly kind of hyper-masculine men, prevented from entering the core of the movement. Adewale, writing in the US, also looked at how Black vegan men could become sort of model fathers, promoted health justice in their community, and challenged a lot of the stereotypes around Black masculinity as kind of natural predators, for example. And then Catherine Oliver, again in the UK, looked at vegans and sort of everyday vegan activists in the UK, and again found that they've shifted their focus through veganism away from a focus on a particular body image, and saw veganism as a real way to kind of connect with how their body feels, again challenging some of these ideas around traditional masculinities. So based on this, I want to then cover a little bit about what my methods and my findings kind of contribute to this. So Yeah, I've conducted around 31 interviews with members of the vegan and animal rights movement in the UK. This includes 13 narrative interviews with women, non-binary and femme individuals, as well as a further 18 life history interviews with men, non-binary and masculine individuals, with an attempt to be gender inclusive within these kind of broad categories that I could be. Essentially, the themes of these interviews were their journeys to veganism, their experiences within the movement, their gendered performances, and then I had slightly more detailed life history interviews with vegan men, trying to understand their life trajectories. How did they become vegan? How did they become animal activists? And how was this interrelated with their understandings of masculinities? And how did these perhaps evolve and develop over time? So yeah, to start off with the kind of the positive, I really saw that multiple interviewees in my narrative interviews expressed how men kind of learned how to do masculinity in a more egalitarian, a more gender equitable way through their veganism. And I'll say that all names are pseudonyms, and some details may have been changed for anonymity. But yeah, Nicole states, I just think like vegan activist men are a bit more in touch with their emotions and empathy because they just, feel a little bit more. And Alice as well just kind of discussed how there were certain men within the movement who are warm, they're coming from a place of humbleness, acceptance, anti-oppression stuff, and they care about things other than veganism. And these things are seen as important in fostering kind of different understanding of masculinity. And again, I saw these kind of discourses emerge in some of my life history interviews with vegan activist men, that they felt that through veganism, they learned to become more empathetic. They became perhaps more aware of their privilege. They had a slightly better understanding of oppression. And they also engaged in a range of other kind of ethical and kind of ecological practices that actually stemmed from their veganism. Right, so Tom talks about how being aware of the privilege of knowing that I don't have to fear particular situations or worry about things, such as how late I'm going to get back home. And he felt that only emerged once he kind of started learning about animal rights and started working in that space. And Matt stated, having empathy in animals is extending my thought then to other people. And, consciously, constantly thinking like, this person is just living their life. Right, so an ethical consideration of animals could extend then to thinking about humans and our human relations. Now, what I want to argue is that when I saw these forms of, these discourses emerge, they were very much related with the organizational level, right? So when organizations were inclusive, when they embraced diversity, when they embraced intersectionality, when women and ethnic minorities and gender minorities were given positions of authority, men were given this opportunity to learn how to do masculinity differently, right? So Tiffany's kind of perhaps encapsulates this when she states, so we have a constitution, within our constitution we have an equality, diversity statement, everyone has to sign up to that. We have a vetting process and we do training around equality and diversity. So for example, we have a deaf member, so every member of the group is required to do sign language training. In James' interview as well, he talked about how in his organization, they had systems of culture being open, spaces for processing emotions, processing our disagreements in a healthy way. There's certain rituals that enable us to connect to our emotions. So a sense that certain organizations could foster certain understandings and kind of allow men to become a bit more empathetic in their relations. So that's kind of the positive picture that emerged from my research. However, I also found that there was what I have described as more superior masculinities that could emerge within the vegan activist space. So Alice, one interview, states, these are men who are coming from this place of superiority. And my initial set of interviews with women and gender minorities described that some men could be argumentative, not approachable, laddish, cocky, and alpha. And importantly, what also emerged is when these superior masculinities were present, this actually ended up distracting from the goals of the movement, right? So Luna states that when these men were present, they often focused on alpha fighting rather than campaign fighting. And even though that she could clearly see it, actually the men, she felt, were not aware of it. So sometimes there was this lack of critical reflection on how, arguing and debating and, sort of focusing on who's the most prominent person in the organization was actually damaging those organizations and potentially damaging the movement. And to get a sense of how this is perhaps damaging the wider movement, this comes from this story from Layla. For example, she describes how she reported an individual who made a misogynistic comment to another member of a particular organization, and this was they are a kind of gender non-conforming Middle Eastern activist, and she was told by a cisgendered white man higher up within this organization, we want to be inclusive to everyone. We can invite them into the group and we can educate them. But she felt that this kind of performative inclusivity actually ended up excluding her from the organization and actually created problems within the movement. And ultimately, this led to her to the conclusion that they're going to see people like us as trying to fight for basic rights really as problematic because they don't know what it's like to be us. And ultimately, they ended up actually stepping away from that particular organization. And I found that around 50% of those initial interviews I did, so 6 participants had actually chosen to leave a particular organization or a particular group because of some form of experience of discrimination or harassment. So when these issues are not addressed within the movement, actually it's damaging the health and the ability of the movement to function. And I also found that some of, and luckily, at least in my interviews, it was a minority, but a few of the the men that I talked to, I argue, sort of misdiagnosed this problem, right? So they were soaring issues in the movement, but rather than self-reflection, for example, Trevor states, intersectionals are the enemy of veganism. It's splitting activism. I won't do activism with them because they say something about them. It's like, I just don't care. Just get on. Just do it for the animals. This discourse where the animals always have to be the priority and dealing with human conflicts should be pushed aside because we need to help animals. Now, whilst I understand where these kind of arguments come from, I think I want to argue, and in line with some of the other research, this actually shows a lack of awareness of how, for a marginalized individual, someone of marginalized gender or marginalized ethnicity, actually encountering a discriminatory view isn't simply a difference of opinion. It's not, I like this political party and you like that political party, but it's actually an embodied experience and their sense of safety within the movement and within that particular group be removed. Now, to end on kind of slightly more positive note, I also saw how men could be advocates to change within the movement. So, New States, when we started, I think we had 6, 7, 8 investigators, male investigators, and describes how investigation within the movement is seen as this very masculine and male-dominated space. And they only had 1 female investigator. And yeah, I could see that there weren't really these opportunities, and it's something that I'm aware of, until we now have 60, 65% female investigators, right? So this was an example of a man within the movement realizing that there was a gender issue and taking positive action to kind of address it and critically reflecting on this. Okay, so yeah, broadly kind of some conclusions that I can take from this and hopefully a few recommendations I feel might be of value to the movement. So I think when the vegan and animal rights movement is a site where men can learn to be more egalitarian, and I think this is really a positive thing that I saw across a lot of my interviews, right? However, for this to kind of happen, this is related to the specific gender structure, which is kind of this concept in which we have to think about how organizations are set up, right? So if individuals are being marginalized from the space, then that kind of prevents those kind of egalitarian masculinities emerging. And yeah, superior masculinities can go unchallenged when marginalized perspectives or individuals speak up and they're then sidelined. And a lack of gender awareness, both among organizations and and individuals, actually ends up harming the movement, right? People left organizations, and again, in some cases, even people choose to leave the movement altogether. So in terms of some sort of simple recommendations I feel stem from my research, I think that groups can should overall try and avoid reframing veganism and animal rights as compatible with traditional notions of masculinity. Actually, that these traditional ideas of masculinity are not going to kind of further the vegan cause and could actually harm it. On the other side of that, I think that there's an opportunity for the vegan animal rights movement to really contribute to our current societal debate around toxic masculinity. right? So when we're talking to young boys about how they can do masculinity differently, we talk about we need to be more empathetic, we need to be more compassionate. And I think that really connects with the vegan movement. And so I think vegans have a real good opportunity here to actually be able to speak and kind of be involved in these conversations, in these spaces. And I haven't really seen much of that happening currently. And finally, I think individuals and organizations need to actively be able to reflect on their own privileges, their own power imbalances, and think about how they could be kind of positive actors for change, maybe rather than serving purely their own self-interest within the movement.
Yeah, so we've got 8 minutes now for questions. I don't think anyone's posted any yet, but yeah, if we do have any questions, please just raise your hand. I think that's okay.
Thank you for your conference. Just thinking about the quotes of ladies on masculinism and also of men about masculinism. Can we have a symmetrical approach, saying that men can think and have a cultural construction about feminism? Are men legitimate to do so? And can we go symmetrical? That's my question. Thank you.
I mean, I would argue that not only is it legitimate for men to engage in conversations around feminism, but it's actually kind of obligatory that they do, right? And I think I've seen quite a bit of conversation about this recently, but it's men that need to be engaging in these conversations around sexual violence, for example, right? It's like the statistics are so strong. It's like, well, almost everyone knows someone in their life who has committed some form of sexual abuse, right? And yet we all know someone who's probably experienced it, but very few of us seemingly know anyone who has perpetrated it. And I think that suggests that we're not able to have these conversations as men with other men. So I think that it's really important that, and obviously we don't want men to dominate the conversation. It should be active listening as the starting point, but men should 100% be engaging in conversations around feminism and feminist issues.
I had a question about, you talked about men, examples where in activist groups and activist circles, they just want to focus on the animals. I wonder to what extent is being vegan and being a vegan activist sometimes a barrier to engaging with or exploring masculinities. There might be this assumption that because I'm doing a good thing, I'm acting in part of the animals, it could be a barrier to sort of them being open to exploring how you're still potentially sort of adopting sort of toxic masculinity tropes or traits, but because it's for a just cause, then that almost makes it harder to see or harder to sort of approach or address.
I think I could have sort of two ways of sort of looking at that. I guess first is hopefully from some of this research, we can see how actually toxic masculinities within vegan spaces ends up harming the movement, so not engaging in that reflection. If you genuinely care about animals, I think that we need to realize that, if we live in a hierarchical society, the bottom of that hierarchy is almost always likely to be not-human animals. So I don't see a scenario in which we have a hierarchical society, gender hierarchies, race hierarchies, and animals are somehow elevated up that hierarchy. They're almost going to end up being at the bottom of it. So that's one element of it. But, and I think the other element is, there can maybe be a separation between maybe like kind of, I guess what you could call like external intersectionality. So, collaborating with other movements, trying to do things actively in other spaces, which is all great, and we can do that. But if you find that, overwhelming and you feel like your passion is for the animals, then that's absolutely fine. There's not a problem with that. But maybe we need more of like what I would call like more like internal intersectionality. So within vegan active spaces, they still need to reflect on, power imbalances within those spaces, so that those spaces can be inclusive, and then ultimately as effective as possible.
I'm going to go to someone who's not.
Hi, yeah, thanks. This has been a really interesting, eye-opening talk. So I've got a 3-year-old, and he currently identifies as a boy, I guess. But because he has long hair, he's wears colourful clothes. Well, we give him colourful clothes to wear, and he's vegan. I'm worried about like how he's going to like fit into the identities that are available, I guess, for children, because there's so much like gender from such a young age for boys and girls in terms of clothing, the toys they're offered. And for him, it's just, they're just children. I just wondered if you'd really spoken to many families with this research, and like, had they struggled with a sort of identity for their children if they were bringing their children up vegan?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's interesting. I think there's real massive overlap in these two things. Yeah, because not majority of my participants were not like parents or whatever, but some were, and one person in particular was a father of a daughter of similar age that you're describing, and he was talking really about how without realizing it, was like all these decisions were just kind of coming. It was like his partner wasn't vegan and went out and brought rocking horse, and he had an issue with that, and that created a conflict in their relationship. And then it was like they wanted to go to the zoo, and he's like, I don't want to go to the zoo. Okay, so we'll go to a sanctuary. But actually turned out the sanctuary was part of sanctuary and then also had essentially a zoo attached to it, right? So it's like it's really difficult to navigate. So yeah, that's not really an answer to the question, but I think it's just an acknowledgement that hopefully the two can be kind of connected, and that if we can get young people thinking more ethically and compassionately, that can translate into both a gender thing and like a vegan animal thing, right? Like we should be compassionate to other people. We should treat other people how we want to be treated, and other people should include all species. And so those two hopefully can be connected in conversations that we can maybe have with young people around this issue. Yeah.
We're at time. We maybe have time for one more question if it's not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was obviously conscious here to not, name any specific organizations. I didn't want it to turn into one of those things where I've just attacked a specific organization because it was, or the other side to say, 100. So to answer your question, I have spoken to people, in vegan runners and those kind of spaces. And one of my methodological things was to try and take as broad of approach to activism as possible. I've spoken to vegan runners, and I do think it's really interesting, that form of soft activism as well. Flying the flag. So I talked to one individual who talked about comparing going to CrossFit gym with going to vegan runners. And they were completely different spaces, and how CrossFit was hyper masculine, competition focused, who can be the strongest and the better. And vegan runners was, come along, have a go, give it a try. I think that's how I feel sport and activity should be, to challenge some of these ideas around masculinity. So it's about community, it's about fitness, it's about, health and work and collaboration together, rather than hyper masculine competition. And not to say there's not value in sort of some competition, but so I think that it's a really positive space vegan run seems to be, and that's the sort of thing that hopefully we can get more of a movement.
that's it. That's been Cameron. Round of applause.